Hi everyone and welcome to episode 70 of ShamanTalk. My name is Rhonda and I'm your host. Now for the next 3 weeks we are going to explore the drama triangle. This is a series and we're going to explore each of the archetypes individually and as a focus of the podcast. So what is the drama triangle? Let's start there just to make sure everybody knows what that is. So the drama triangle is something that I discovered in my training. It was brought up. It was really useful for me. I was really stuck in a lot of those archetypes, really stuck in the drama of my life, and I found the drama triangle to be an excellent model to be able to say, okay, what am I doing and why? How do I escape it? What changes can I make? That kind of thing. So the drama triangle wiki describes it as a model of the connection between personal responsibility and power in conflicts and the destructive shifting roles that people play. So basically the drama triangle refers to a dysfunctional model of human interaction. Okay, and the three roles are victim, saviour or rescuer, and perpetrator or persecutor. The saviour, rescuer, perpetrator, persecutor are interchangeable. And in this series we're going to explore each one of those archetypes and invite you to explore these roles within yourself and within others in your life as well. So it's important that we first explore our own interactions with the drama triangle, as it would be easy, and I see this all the time, for people to project outwardly that which they wish to avoid in themselves. So this is a wee shadow reminder before we jump into this podcast. Be careful with this work that you're not projecting your own archetypal tendencies onto other people. Okay, so let's dive into our first archetype for week 1 of the Drama Triangle series, the victim. Such a deep space, the victim space. And the archetypes are really pervasive and deeply entrenched in our culture, I think, especially Western culture. I think everybody can relate to the victim. You know, we love to root for the underdog, the downtrodden, the disadvantaged. Especially in story, you know, the victim is usually the hero in the beginning, if you think about it that way. The hero's journey. The hero often goes through the victim stage. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, because hidden within the victim is the victor. And I think that part of the fascination with this archetype and our attachment to it is the desire for transformation and personal empowerment that comes from moving from the victim to the victor. It's the hero's journey. But there's definitely a deep shadow side to the victim. People get stuck in the archetype. They become absolutely, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, I've lost the word. But we really do need to identify the victim within us in order to transform into the victor. In other words, we need to drop the victim mentality and step into our own power. But what I found with my work and with myself is that there's so much about the victim mentality that's hidden. People just simply don't see it, or they see it in others but don't realise it's a projection of their own victim archetype, their own victim shadow. And the root of the victim archetype is a fear that you can't survive or will not survive. But not just a physical survival, but like the survival of your identity, your hopes and dreams or sense of self. And I think deep down there's a belief that you don't deserve to thrive, or that you're not good enough. And the victim, being the victim, is a way to have some kind of passive control over your life. So the victim lives their life in fear, but it comes out as feeling oppressed, helpless, hopeless, powerless, ashamed. And this dejected approach to life will prevent them from taking responsibility for themselves, their circumstances, and their actions. And the funny thing that I find about victims, and I talk about victims in the global sense, which includes myself. I have worked very hard on this archetype within me. But the funny thing about it is that all victims are quite entitled. So it might take you some time to see your own sense of entitlement. But it's important to identify it to be able to transform this archetype from shadow to light. And we'll talk more later about the different types of entitlement that victims tend to have. And it's not what you think. So that's my research and my thinking and my journey on this podcast really did open my eyes to some really interesting entitlement issues that I still have. Okay, so working through the victim might be one of the most difficult things you do. It was one of the most difficult things I had to do in my life, along with the Saviour and Perpetrator, I have to say as well. But it is life altering when we can do that. Okay, so the victim always has a villain. There's always a villain of the story when it comes to victims. And really, it's impossible to have a victim without a villain, isn't it? So if we're talking about individuals who are listening to this podcast, your villain might be something really simple like your work schedule or your seasonal allergies. But it doesn't take long for the victim to perceive the situation as a perpetrator or as a villain. Okay, there are extreme examples, of course, of victims and villains. You know, prisoners of war and their captors, child and abusive parent, jailer, convict. But really the dynamics between the two are the same. The villain has the perceived power, and in circumstances that we're talking about that don't involve these extreme cases, it's a perceived power, and the victim is powerless and at the mercy of the other, so they think. So recognising your villain is just as important as recognising your victimisation. So here's a few things that you can think about when it comes to feeling victimised in your life. And I've tried to be quite open here, I've tried to be quite honest, so hopefully none of this is triggering for people. But if it is triggering for you, consider it to be the spirits talking to you and calling out to you and letting you know that this is something that you can think about and you might want to work with or work on. So motherhood or fatherhood, being a parent. So feeling like a victim to your children and their care as though you don't have any choice. I've been there. Illness, injury or disease is a common villain. So the person can feel a victim to their body, feeling they have no control over whether the body will heal or that your body has failed you and you can't come to terms with an injury or a disease. That is a villain to the victim. Insomnia or allergies or things like that, and these show the lack of control that these issues can cause, can plunge any normal person into instant victimisation. Money is another major villain for many people and has been for me over the years. So the lack of money, feeling victimised maybe by debt collectors, feeling like you don't make the amount of money you deserve. Things like that are examples of how you might feel victimised by your lack of money. Or on the flip side, people often feel like wealth is a burden and you feel victimised by how others expect you to help them with your loads and loads of money. So your relationship to money is a really great place to observe your victim. So jobs can be a source of victimisation. You can feel unhappy or abused in a job or feel powerless to change a situation. Excuse me. You might find yourself victim to others' expectations or demands, that kind of thing. So your job or your career can be a villain of the piece. Gender can also be a villain. You can feel victimised by being a woman or a man. especially by the roles that the Western culture expects of both men and women. Education, as you may feel constrained or controlled by the system of education that decides what hoops you have to leap through in order to get a degree, for example, or that you're made to go to school as a younger person and you don't want to. Religion can be extremely victimising because of the stringent expectations and demands that many religious organisations require of you to be a good member. This is true of any organisation really, but in a religious setting the stakes are higher because usually your soul or personal salvation is on the line. So your villain could be religion. Another really common villain is the appearance of your body. So maybe you think you're overweight, or you're too old, or your genetic inheritance, like sticky out ears or buck teeth or whatever it is. So, or for example, genetic disease inheritance is like, 3 generations of my family died of heart attack, so I'll probably die that way too. Being overweight runs in my family. I have a fiery personality because of my red hair. So, there's an element of blame there and not taking responsibility. So that becomes the villain. It's the villain's fault. It's the genetic inheritance's fault. What was the next one? So the expectations of our culture, stereotypes and whatnot, can be a real means to falling into victimisation. You might feel shame about your heritage, when you're trying to fit in, you're moved from a different country. And this can cause you to feel like a victim to how others perceive you. Obviously, that's a hot topic at the moment, and everybody has their own personal responsibilities to educate and to become aware of the issues of the world and how we live in this world right now. But this is about the individual person and what we can do to not fall victim to the villains in our life. So many people resign themselves sorrowfully to fate. They feel like victims of fate, believing they're unable to have any control over their own destinies. One of the key aspects of the victim archetype is the avoidance of personal responsibility. And a final word on examples of villains of the piece, things that make us feel like a victim, and probably the most powerful of all of the villains are our own thoughts, emotions and fears. These inner perpetrators have more power to victimise than any of the other villains put together, I suspect. And we'll come to that later, a little bit more about how we can overcome that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a look at the victim's relationship with the 2 other archetypes in the drama triangle. So the victim and the saviour, and the victim and the perpetrator. So although we will mention a little bit about the saviour and perpetrator, we won't go too much into detail about them specifically here, only about how the victim relates to them. And then in the coming weeks, we'll cover the saviour and the perpetrator in the same detail. So, the victim will always require an enabler. And the victim and the saviour usually go quite well together, and in most relationships where there's a strong victim, there will also be a saviour nearby, ready to rush in and reinforce the victim's victimisation. Victims demand a saviour, usually. So, they need a saviour to help them feel justified and entitled. And saviours enjoy their role because it guarantees the victim will keep needing them, and they will have the loyalty and acceptance of the victim, as well as a cultural nod of approval for the support of the victim. So if you're not sure about your victim and the mask it wears, have a look for the saviour in your life. Saviours are easy to spot because they are the person that you seek out when you want someone to sympathise with your struggle and they encourage the indignant sense of the victim being wronged. Yeah, so this is the person that you go to moan and complain about your life, and they make you feel validated and heard in a non-empowered way. And, a little bit extra thing up there about saviours, they enjoy the attention, they enjoy being special because they're maybe the only one that the victim can talk to, because other people have decided that that's not what they're there for. And the trap of approval for the saviour, the saviour's as blind as the victim. This relationship is carried out on a shadow level. Okay, so the victim and the perpetrator. Now, what's interesting is a victim can really create a perpetrator, but can also what's the way to put that? When we're feeling victimised, we're almost always in the act of victimising someone else simultaneously. So you can create perpetrators through your actions. So you're ill, you're feeling victimised by your disease, and you're complaining and suffering loudly. And you make your illness the centre of all attention, and nothing can be more important. So others then become overlooked, not listened to, and they become angry, and the perpetrator comes out. Not saying it's right or wrong either way, but this is what we create as a victim. And obviously when we get to the perpetrator or the persecutor archetype, we'll look more deeply into that and what that means. But this is from the victim's perspective. Another example is, you're feeling like a victim and you withdraw from people close to you. That can be very painful to loved ones and can create a perpetrator role. You have no time for me, you don't love, what's wrong with you, why can't you just feel better, whatever it is. So a victim is a very powerful part of the drama triangle and can really create a lot of tension, can create saviour, can pull saviours in. Usually they feel them come in and will pull them into the drama triangle, and will often create perpetrators through their actions. Now let's talk about self-victimisation. So this is really sneaky, this one. So self-victimisation is a sneaky way of being a victim without being so obvious. But the pattern is really identical to any of the other victim-villain relationships that we talked about. So here are some of the things that you might recognise as a self-victimisationer. I don't know if that's even a word, but let's just use it anyway. So you victimise yourself by beating up on yourself, speaking harshly, and regarding yourself with disdain and self-loathing. You don't accept praise easily from others, and you're not willing to look at your own successes and personal empowerment without having a secret dagger to stab yourself in the back. So of all of the victim dynamics, self-victimisation has the strongest element of entitlement. We talked about entitlement earlier on. Now, this is really hard for me to get my head around when I first started doing this work. And even now, sometimes I have to go back to the drawing board and really think about my own victim and entitlement relationship. So there's a deep, unconscious belief that the self-abuse the victim regularly inflicts is a great big permission slip. I have suffered, so I am entitled to my unhappiness, my grief, my depression, my pain, my revenge, etc. This sort of entitlement can be so difficult to spot that many who do self-victimise are unaware of their entitlement. Yeah? So self-victimisation says, I will never have what I need and want because there is something wrong with me. And that gives you the entitlement to complain, to remain stuck, to impose your suffering on other people, and to reject those that would offer genuine support or a hand up and out. Yeah, can you feel that? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some variants of the victim and their entitlement, because I really feel like this is a really good connection to make. It was really useful for me to make the connection between victim and the entitlement that made me feel. So this wee list should help you to spot the way your own victim behaves. Okay, so there's names for these. So the patient. So you're a victim to your health or lack thereof, victim to bodily functions, diseases or injuries. And the victim variant, the patient feels entitled to be healthy, to be healed, and to have someone else responsible for your health and healing, such as a doctor, surgeon, shaman, herbalist, nutritionist, whatever. And they also feel entitled to blame their health professional, when things don't go their way. And these types of patients often don't make the changes necessary to effect the healing that they're looking for. Yeah? So they feel entitled to health. They can't get to that point and they blame others for that. So there's one. So if you are a victim to someone else's desires, manipulation, demands and absolute control, so like a bit like a prisoner, then that victim mentality makes you feel entitled to revenge, exploitation, justice, and not in a good way, and anger. And while that may seem like a good course of action in some particularly abusive situations, as I have been in myself, revenge, anger, exploitation do not do any good to anybody. But there's a sense of entitlement there, that I can feel this way, I can do these things, I can act this way because I am a victim to this person. So the long sufferer, I'm sure we've all known one of these, I definitely have, is a victim to circumstances and other people's actions. Nothing ever goes right, it's always wrong, this always happens to me, oh, I'm not surprised, blah blah blah. And these people feel entitled to sympathy, attention, they feel entitled to complain, and they feel entitled to the constant support of others despite taking no responsibility for their life, but they feel entitled to these things. So those who are victim to internal programming and internal stories, but like a robot, I guess. So you'll know the type of person that, like this, the story they tell you is constantly the same. It never changes. The characters may change and the settings may change, but the story doesn't change. And usually these types of victims feel entitled to being disconnected, judgmental and superior. So those who are victim to external demands. So they are victim to the belief that they're helpless, overwhelmed, handicapped. And people that feel like that believe they're entitled to inaction, confusion, and they have a fear of being helped. They're not interested in being helped, they want to stay helpless. The victim of loneliness, negativity and self-hatred. So you're a victim to these things. Self-victimization. They often feel entitled to recruit others into being victims and victimizing those who they believe deserve to be punished. Usually there's doomsday sayers, everything, what is wrong with the world, conspiracy theory types, that kind of thing. But there's an entitlement there. the doormat. So they're victim to being taken advantage of, overworked, used, abused. I recognise this one myself. I've been there. I know a lot of my clients I work with are in that space, have been in that space or are in that space. Now they feel entitled to love, support, acceptance, approval and friendship, but they never get love, support, acceptance, approval or friendship because they have no boundaries, they have no way to ask for what they need, they have no way to cultivate and enter into healthy, well-balanced relationships. So those who are victims to their own inadequacies and lack of confidence feel entitled to withdraw or hide. So you hide your true feelings, you judge others, and other people have to understand you, like they have to read your mind. You're not willing to speak up or be seen. The dummy, so those who have a perceived lack of intelligence and mental acuity. I see this a lot. They think they're entitled to be uninformed, blameless and irresponsible. I don't know. Well, that's just the way it is. Well, I just did it. I don't know why. Yeah. The user. So the victim to scarcity, want deficiency. So they'll moan about high petrol prices and school fees, and they'll use terms like highway robbery, and they feel entitled to charity, to ask for favours, for aid and assistance, as well as to blame others who they perceive to be better off as well. So that's their entitlement. That's what they feel entitled to do because of their victimisation, because of their victim archetype. Okay. So you can see how maybe you can start to see how your personal victim expresses itself. And while there's so many variants to this, hopefully that list will help you to identify the wee shadow victim in yourself and how the shadow victim kind of hides and shows itself in a really interesting way. So, what do we do about it? You're like, oh, thanks, Rhonda, you've just given me this list of stuff that's wrong with me. What the hell am I meant to do with that? Well, make some changes. How do we do that? What do those changes look like? Well, for me, there were many, many steps that I took. I'll rattle them off. I started working with the 4 agreements. In particular, don't take it personally, and use that as a mantra. The 4 agreements was a book by a man called Don Miguel Ruiz. It was life-changing for me, along with How to Heal Toxic Thoughts. Those 2 books were excellent in helping me to overcome my victim mentality. So I can recommend that you give those a wee read. And really what we're looking to do is we're looking to feel the fear, feel the victim, and just overcome it and do something different. And not running away from the realisation that you have a bit of a shadow victim running a bit of your show is really a key part to this. We're looking to find personal power. We're looking to shift our victim to victor, to a victor. And the victor understands that real power comes from within and is bound up with radical personal responsibility. So when you shift yourself from the victor, you can't blame others because you can see that a loss of power happens from within. So a victor will ask themselves, okay, what can I do with this situation I've been given? And there are some things in life that are not for us to decide, like a debilitating illness or abuse or any of the other plethora of traumas, death, grief, accidents, health issues that can beset us in life. So those aren't for us to decide. We don't get to decide our fate, but we can decide what we do with what we've been given. And I guess for me, that's a really encouraging thought. So, compassion. Learning how to not take things personally. Recognising our victim and recognising our villain and starting to change our mindset. Working with boundaries. So one reason that people are often become victims is because they have no boundaries. Now that's a whole other podcast. In fact, there are already podcasts on how I work with boundaries, and I recommend if you recognise a lot of yourself in this podcast that you go ahead and try listening to some of the boundary work that we've already covered in the podcast in the past. So the victor is aware of exactly where the boundaries are and why boundaries should be maintained. So really super simple. Feeling angry, irritated or annoyed is a really good way to tell if your boundaries have been crossed and if victimisation is about to kick in. So when you move into victor space, it helps you to understand and define what your boundaries are. So again, there's a whole podcast on how to do that. And then it lets you know when your boundaries are being violated. So having and maintaining healthy boundaries makes it much more difficult for others to take advantage of you and to victimise you. So that's your radical personal responsibility. You need to learn how to say no. You need to learn how to put yourself first. You need to learn how to do that. And the only way to learn is to recognise that you have an issue and then start making small steps every day. You know, vulnerability. Working with knowing you're not being afraid to show weakness and fragility because you maintain, because you know that vulnerability is a strength. I would go and check out the work of Brené Brown, who works with shame and vulnerability. So as a victor, you're no longer afraid then of failures, losses, tragedies, suffering, misfortune, because none of these outer circumstances has the power to control your life. And vulnerability is the keystone of that strength because it allows you to discover different kinds of power and especially recognise the strength of openness. So vulnerability, compassion, daily gratitude practice, using mantras, working with books that perhaps have inspired you. And of course, in the next section, we'll be doing some work with our guides and our spiritual team to help us to make sense of our victim to victor journey, our hero's journey that we're on. And what I would hate is if you'd listen to this podcast and now you don't feel good enough, you feel terrible, oh my God, I'm such a victim, oh that's terrible, because you're still being a victim at that point. What I really hope that you can take from this podcast is that you're on a hero's journey, that you're right at maybe you're right at the beginning, maybe you're slightly further on, or maybe you've been round it once or twice. I mean, I've been round the victim hero's journey a few times and I still keep going round the hero's journey and I'll continue to do that. There are always layers. If you're brand new to this and you're like, oh no, just don't panic. What has happened here is that the universe has given you knowledge. Oh, I have an issue. Now I know that I have an issue, I can start to move towards the victor space. I can start to move around the hero's journey. I can start to make changes. I can start to overcome this victim mentality that's been ruining my life. So now we're going to move on to part 2, to the activities and journeys section. So go ahead and get yourself a wee pen and bit of paper and I'll see you in just a second. Hi and welcome back to part 2 of episode 70, working with the victim archetype. I just want to repeat that this can be a tough subject, especially if it's new. I remember discovering the drama triangle and discovering for me it was actually the saviour that was a little bit more crushing than the victim. The victim realisation came later for me, but the first one that came to me was the saviour, and it was such a crushing blow to realise how much that archetype ran my life. It was crushing and really overwhelming. So I just want to let you know that if that's how you're feeling, that's okay. That's okay. And what we're going to do now is a couple of exercises to support you with this journey. This is what we're all about here. We work with, the drama triangle was created by a guy called Cartman in the 60s, and is still relevant. Absolutely not shamanic and not my work, but a brilliant what's the word I'm looking for? It's just a brilliant model for dysfunctional human relationships. So in these sections, what we do now is we bring the shamanic, the spiritual element into these different models, because that's often what people are missing. Because you can do all of the work, you can read the books, and I hear this a lot, I know all this, Rhonda, I've read about this, and I ask people, well, have you made the changes? And they'll say no, and I'll say why, and they say I don't know why. And often it's because they're missing these extra bits, these spiritual interventions, this connection to spirit. Okay, so the first journey, which takes into account how this is a tough subject, the first journey I invite you to try is to journey with your guides to the spirit of the victor. Okay, ask to be shown what it feels like to be empowered in your life and how you can cultivate that for yourself. You can also ask for healing to support your work to escape the victim role. Okay, so I know I got you to get a pen and piece of paper, but if you didn't and you want this information, it's all in the show notes at centreforshamanism.com/70. And we'll put in the links to the few things I've mentioned, like the books and Brené Brown as well. I'll put some links in there for you so that you can go straight and check those out, those books and other recommendations. So next, what I'd like you to do, this is a bit more of we're going to start off with a bit of a cognitive exercise. I'd like you to ask yourself what changes you're ready and willing to make in your life. So write a list of the thoughts you had during the podcast about those changes. What did you think when you were listening? Oh, yeah, my job really victimises me, really turns me into a victim. So you recognise that. So what changes are you willing to make there? And how does that list make you feel? So spend some time on that. Does it make you feel overwhelmed? Does it make you feel excited or nervous? So spend some time thinking about how you feel. And then what I'd like you to do is take your feelings on a journey with your guides and ask to be shown the root of your fears. And ask for a ceremony that you can perform to help release the root of those fears. Alright? So you're taking your feelings on a journey and you're going to ask to be shown the root of your fears. And then you're going to ask for a ceremony that you can perform to help release the root of those fears. I think that'll be enough for you to be getting on with at the moment. So this is quite a deep week. We don't always get into this much detail in a podcast, or the activities and journeys are a little bit more in depth. Take your time with it. Be gentle with yourself. Don't rush. This isn't a race. This is a lifelong path. So take things at your own pace. Take things gently. Don't forget that you can call your guides in, your spiritual team, at any point, day or night, regardless of what you're doing. You can just think of them and they'll be there. So don't forget that deep spiritual connection that you have with your guides. And don't forget to call them in if you need them. Maybe you're fine with the victim. Maybe you've done the work, or maybe it's not something that you think that you suffer from particularly enough to worry about it. You know, I'm sure we all have elements of victim, but sometimes it's not an issue for everybody. And that's okay too. So I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. I really enjoyed the process of creating the podcast, I have to say. And what I'd like to do is remind you that next week and the week after are part of a series. So do this work and then join us again next week for part 2 and then for part 3. And it'll really pull together this dysfunctional human dynamic that we can work with. I think it's a really good process to go through. And then finally, the last thing I want to say is that this is really focused on the individual. But what you can also do is you can recognise victims in your life who aren't you. And you can work with your boundaries with victims. You can say no, you can put time limits on conversations, or you can simply walk away and say, this really isn't the energy that I want in my life, and I don't really want to deal with this. You can also do that. So do keep your eye out for victims in your life and work towards keeping yourself and your energy within your own body and within your own field as well. So thanks very much for listening. I had great fun with you this week. I look forward to seeing you all in the group. Can't wait to hear how you get on with your activities and journeys. And I'll see you all same time, same place next week. Hey, thank you so much for listening. We love it. We love you. We love connecting with you on our podcast. We're really pushing our Facebook community right now. It is where all the juicy shamanic stuff happens. So if you'd like to join us in that community, you'll find us on Facebook and look for the Centre for Shamanism community group. And we'll see you there.